Now comes the time for part 2 of Unrestricted War. Unrestricted War. Now let's make it. How do we up the ante? Unrestricted War. Unrestricted War. Okay guys, for serious now, it's time for part 2 of Unrestricted War. The book by Chao Long and Wang Xiangsu. And I'm butchering those names, but that doesn't matter. There's a fan on in the background. If I turn that off, it'll be deathly hot in here, so hopefully that's not coming up in the feedback. Alright, so last time we read part 1. Let's change screens here. Last time we read part 1. Which was called On New Warfare, and a quick summary of that was they sort of highlighted how the century has changed and how technology is kind of guiding humanity, but we're not really interested in science so much as we are obsessed with technological toys. And they also go over how this age really doesn't have one label in the way that you could call the steam age or the electrical age. People use terms like the nuclear age or the information age to define this time, but they claim that that's really just one aspect, trying to define the whole scope of humanity with one aspect, like one facet of a diamond. Talking about how obsolescence comes so quickly, like they bring up a Russian fighter, the Su-27, and how it hasn't even been used yet in battle, but there's already the Su-35, and soon, someday, that will become obsolete. And they're really setting up the book, basically how, they're going to set up a premise. That part 1, if we jump back over to the browser, was on New Warfare, and they were really setting up the platform and the premise of the book. So go watch part 1 if you want to go over that. Today we'll be reading chapter 1, The Weapons Revolution, which invariably comes first, and this was pages 10 to 33 in the original. Again, we're reading an abridged version by the CIA, a translated version. So let us begin. As soon as technological advances may be applied to military goals, and furthermore are already used for military purposes, they almost immediately seem obligatory, and also often go against the will of the commanders in triggering changes or even revolutions in the modes of combat. Engels. The weapons revolution invariably precedes the revolution in military affairs by one step, and following the arrival of a revolutionary weapon, the arrival of the revolution in military affairs is just a matter of time. The history of warfare is continually providing this kind of proof. Bronze or iron spears resulted in the infantry phalanx, and bows and arrows and stirrups provided new tactics for cavalry. Black powder cannons gave rise to a full complement of modern warfare modes, from the time when conical bullets and rifles took the battlefield as the vanguard of the age of technology. Weapons straightaway stamped their names on the chest of warfare. First, it was the enormous steel-clad naval vessels that ruled the seas, launching the age of battleships. Then its brother, the tank, ruled land warfare, after which the airplane dominated the skies, up until the atomic bomb was born, announcing the approach of the nuclear age. Today, a multitude of new and advanced technology weapons continues to pour forth, so that weapons have solemnly become the chief representative of war. When people discuss future warfare, they are already quite accustomed to using certain weapons or certain technologies to describe it, calling it electronic warfare, precision weapons warfare, and information warfare. Coasting along in their mental orbit, people have not yet noticed that a certain inconspicuous yet very important change is stealthily approaching. No one has the right to label warfare. The weapons revolution is a prelude to a revolution in military affairs. What is different than in the past is that the revolution in military affairs that is coming will no longer be driven by one or two individual weapons. In addition to continuing to stimulate people to yearn for and be charmed by new weapons, the numerous technological inventions have also quickly eradicated the mysteries of each kind of weapon. In the past, all that was needed was the invention of a few weapons or pieces of equipment, such as the stirrup and the Maxim machine gun, and that was sufficient to alter the form of war, whereas today, upwards of 100 kinds of weapons are needed to make up a certain weapon system before it can have an overall effect on war. However, the more weapons are invented, the smaller an individual weapon's role in war becomes, and this is a paradox that is inherent in the relationship between weapons and war. Speaking in that sense, other than the all-out use of nuclear weapons, a situation which is more and more unlikely, and which may be termed nuclear war, none of the other weapons, even those that are extremely revolutionary in nature, possesses the right to label future war. As I said in the setup, they're really building upon the idea that technology and its rapid evolution, as they were saying in the first few paragraphs, the obsolescence of weapons, the fact that you can't label an age based on a certain technology, they're really building on their thesis for this whole book. Perhaps it is precisely because people recognize this point that we then have formulations such as high-tech warfare and information warfare, whose intent is to use the broad concept of technology to replace the concept of specific weapons, using a fuzzy learning approach to resolve this knotty problem. However, it seems that this still is not the way to resolve the problem. When one delves deeply into this, the term high technology, which first appeared in the architectural industry in the United States, is in fact a bit vague. What constitutes high technology? What does it refer to? Logically speaking, high and low are only relative concepts. However, using an extremely mutable concept in this irrational manner to name warfare, which is evolving endlessly, in itself constitutes a considerable problem. When one generation's high technology becomes low technology with the passage of time, are we still prepared to again dub the new toys that continue to appear as being high tech? Or is it possible that in today's technological explosion, this may result in confusion and trouble for us in naming and using each new technology that appears? Not to mention the question of just what should be the standard to determine whether something is high or not. With regard to technology itself, each technology has specific aspects, which therefore means that each has its time limits. Yesterday's high is very possibly today's low, while today's new will in turn become tomorrow's old. Compared to the M60 tank, the Cobra helicopter, and the B-52, the main battle weapons of the 60s and 70s, the Abrams tank, the Apache helicopter gunship, the F-117, the Patriot missiles, and the Tomahawk cruise missiles are high-tech. However, faced with the B-2, the F-22, the Comanche helicopter, and the J-STARS Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, they in turn seem outmoded. It is as if to say there is the concept of high-tech weapons, which is a variable throughout, and which naturally becomes the title of The Bride. Then, as, quote, the flowers bloom each year, but the people change, all that is left is the empty shell of a name, which is continually placed on the head of the girl who is becoming the next, quote, bride. Then, in the chain of warfare, with its continuous links, each weapon can go from high to low and from new to old at any time and any place, with time zero being unwilling to stop at any point. Nor can any weapon occupy the throne of high technology for long. Since this is the case, just what kind of high technology does this so-called high-tech warfare refer to? High technology, as spoken of in generalities, cannot become a synonym for future warfare, nor is information technology, which is one of the high technologies of the present age and which seems to occupy an important position in the makeup of all modern weapons, sufficient to name a war. Even if in future wars all the weapons have information components embedded in them and are fully computerized, we can still not term such a war information warfare, and at most we can just call it computerized warfare. This is because, regardless of how important information technology is, it cannot completely supplant the functions and roles of each technology per se. For example, the F-22 fighter, which already fully embodies information technology, is still a fighter, and the Tomahawk missile is still a missile, and one cannot lump them all together as information weapons, nor can war which is conducted using these weapons be termed information warfare. Computerized warfare in the broad sense and information warfare in the narrow sense are two completely different things. The former refers to the various forms of warfare which are enhanced and accompanied by information technology, while the latter primarily refers to war in which information technology is used to obtain or suppress information. In addition, the contemporary myth created by information warship has people mistakenly believing that it is the only rising technology, while the sun has already set on all the others. This kind of myth may put more money in the pockets of Bill Gates, but it cannot alter the fact that the development of information technology similarly relies on the development of other technology, and the development of related materials technology is a direct constraint on information technology breakthroughs. For example, the development of biotechnology will determine the future fate of information technology. Speaking of bioinformation technology, we may as well return to a previous topic and again make a small assumption. If people use information-guided bioweapons to attack a biocomputer, should this be counted as biowarfare or information warfare? I fear that no one will be able to answer that in one sentence, but this is something which is perfectly capable of happening. Actually, it is basically not necessary for people to rack their brains over whether or not information technology will grow strong and unruly today, because it itself is a synthesis of other technologies, and its first appearance and every step forward are all a process of blending with the other technologies, so that it is a part of them, and they are a part of it. And this is precisely the most fundamental characteristic of the age of technological integration and globalization. Naturally, like the figures from a steel seal, this characteristic may leave its typical imprint on each modern weapon. We are by no means denying that in future warfare, certain advanced weapons may play a leading role. However, as for determining the outcome of war, it is now very difficult for anyone to occupy an unmatched position. It may be leading, but it will not be alone, much less never changing, which is also to say that there is no one who can unblushingly stamp his own name on a given modern war. So if that started to get really circular and tongue-tied, I was getting really tongue-tied myself. You know, they even had that sentence in there. It's not necessary for people to rack their brains over whether or not information technology will be blah, blah, blah. They're basically building upon their thesis of how integrated things are becoming. If we are, genetically modifying people, let's just say, which China's begun to do, that's going to be just as integral a part of how fast information technology is developed and used, just like how materials affect information technology. Computers right now, there was an interview, I forget the guy's name, but he was interviewed on Joe Rogan. He was the guy who made Doom and Quake, and he's a real nerd, and he talks about how the limit right now is materials with the microchip. This weird phenomenon happens now where the electron is traveling down the circuit and they're so small that an electron can spontaneously essentially teleport to the next circuit, so you're not getting these controllable streams of information. It's this weird phenomenon. They call it quantum tunneling. So they need some sort of different material to evolve to make circuits work better. That's been the sort of constraint on the evolution of computing power. Again, they're just trying to build how this stuff's all integrated, and nothing by itself can take the lead. So it's not really accurate to just say we're in an information age or information warfare as just one sole component. Fighting the fight that fits one's weapons and making the weapons to fit the fight. These two sentences, fight the fight that fits one's weapons and build the weapons to fit the fight, show the clear demarcation line between traditional warfare and future warfare, as well as pointing out the relationship between weapons and tactics in the two kinds of war. The former reflects the involuntary or passive adaptation of the relationship of man to weapons and tactics in war, which takes place under natural conditions, while the latter suggests the conscious or active choice that people make regarding the same proposition when they have entered a free state. That was a mouthful. In the history of war, the general unwritten rule that people have adhered to all along is to fight the fight that fits one's weapons. Very often, it is the case that only after one first has a weapon does one begin to formulate tactics to match it. With weapons coming first, followed by tactics, the evolution of weapons has a decisive constraining effect on the evolution of tactics. Naturally, there are limiting factors here involving the age and the technology, but neither can we say that there is no relationship between this and the linear thinking in which each generation of weapons-making specialists only thinks about whether or not the performance of the weapon itself is advanced and does not consider other aspects. Something tells me that some of this translation is clunky and the languages don't fully transfer, but I think the point's simple enough. They're just saying it goes both ways. Naturally, there are limiting factors here involving the age and the technology, but neither can we say that there is no relationship between this and the linear thinking in which each generation of weapons making specialists. Yeah, that's a mouthful. I think we can keep going though. Perhaps this is one of the factors why a weapons revolution invariably precedes a revolution in military affairs. Although the expression fight the fight that fits one's weapons is essentially negative in nature because what it leaves unsaid reflects a kind of helplessness, we have no intention of belittling the positive meaning that it has today, and this positive meaning is seeking the optimum tactics for the weapons one has. In other words, seeking the combat mode which represents the best match for the given weapons, thereby seeing that they perform up to their peak values. Today, those engaged in warfare have now either consciously or unconsciously completed the transition of this rule from the negative to the positive. It is just that people still wrongfully believe that this is the only initiative that can be taken by backward countries in their helplessness. They hardly realize that the United States, the foremost power in the world, must similarly face this kind of helplessness. Even though she is the richest in the world, it is not necessarily possible for her to use up her uniform, new and advanced technology weapons to fight an expensive modern war. It is just that she has more freedom when it comes to the selection and pairing up of new and old weapons. Now, they wrote this in 1999, which was just before we re-entered the Middle East, under Bush and Cheney, and extended through Obama. Their points are really highlighted, and that's what I keep thinking of as I'm reading these paragraphs, because the bodies that represented the opposition in those countries, let's say the Taliban, the insurgency, whatever you want to call it, they were fighting an asymmetric war, and they may have had more limited technology, but they were able to use a lot more tactics to fit their weapons, as this is kind of highlighting. For example, with improvised explosive devices, hiding within civilian populations, using innocent civilians as either shields or people to attach bombs to, not always voluntarily, became very expensive and drawn out. But let's keep moving on. If one can find a good point of agreement, which is to say the most appropriate tactics, the pairing up and use of new and older generation weapons, not only makes it possible to eliminate the weakness of uniform weaponry, it may also become a multiplier to increase the weapon's effectiveness. The B-52 bomber, which people have predicted on many occasions is long since ready to pass away peacefully, has once again become resplendent after being coupled with cruise missiles and other precision-guided weapons, and its wings have not yet rested to date. By the use of external infrared-guided missiles, the A-10 aircraft now has night attack capabilities that it originally lacked, and when paired with the Apache helicopter, they complement each other nicely, so that this weapons platform, which appeared in the mid-70s, is very imposing. Obviously, fight the fight that fits one's weapons by no means represents passive inaction. For example, today's increasingly open weapons market and multiple supply channels have provided a great deal of leeway with regard to weapon selection, and the massive coexistence of weapons, which span multiple generations, has provided a broader and more functional foundation for transgeneration weapons combinations than at any age in the past. so that it is only necessary to break with our mental habit of treating the weapons generations, uses, and combinations as being fixed to be able to turn something that is rotten into something miraculous. If one thinks that one must rely on advanced weapons to fight a modern war, being blindly superstitious about the miraculous effects of such weapons, it may actually result in turning something miraculous into something rotten. We find ourselves in a stage where a revolutionary leap forward is taking place in weapons, going from weapon systems symbolized by gunpowder to those symbolized by information, and this may be a relatively prolonged period of alternating weapons. At present, we have no way of predicting how long this period may last, but what we can say for sure is that as long as this alternation has not come to an end, fighting the kind of battle that fits one's weapons will be the most basic approach for any country in handling the relationship between weapons and combat, and this includes the United States, the country which has the most advanced weapons. What must be pointed out is that the most basic thing is not the thing with the greatest future. Aggressive initiatives under negative preconditions is only a specific approach for a specific time, and by no means constitutes an eternal rule. In man's hands, scientific progress has long since gone from passive discovery to active invention, and when the Americans proposed the concept of building the weapons to fit the fight, it triggered the greatest single change in the relationship between weapons and tactics since the advent of war. First, determine the mode of combat, then develop the weapons, and in this regard, the first stab that the Americans took at this was air-land battle, while the currently popular digitized battlefield and digitized units, which have given rise to much discussion, represent their most recent attempt. This approach indicates that the position of weapons in invariably preceding a revolution in military affairs has now been shaken, and now tactics come first and weapons follow, or the two encourage one another, with advancement in a push-pull manner becoming the new relationship between them. At the same time, weapons themselves have produced changes with epoch-making significance, and their development no longer looks only to improvements in the performance of individual weapons, but rather to whether or not the weapons have good characteristics for linking and matching them with other weapons. As with the F-111, which was in a class by itself at the time because it was too advanced, there was no way to pair it up with other weapons, so all they could do was shelve it. That lesson has now been absorbed, and the thinking that tries to rely on one or two new advanced technology weapons to serve as killer weapons, which can put an end to the enemy, is now outmoded. So again, this makes me think of our prolonged battle in the Middle East. I'm not exactly sure what kind of examples of weapons being tailored to the fight, but perhaps like with the problem of improvised explosive devices, you're going to need better measures of detecting and eradicating those things, I would assume. Maybe that's a bad example, but you can watch Jocko Willink's podcast. He talks a lot about how they updated, I forget the name of it, but he goes through in one of the most recent podcasts, he goes over the manual that was updated in like 2006 or 2008 by General Mattis and General Petraeus in order to deal with the new type of insurgency, close urban combat in an area where people weren't necessarily pro-American. Sometimes they were not. Sometimes they started pro-American and then, they were terrorized into becoming against America. Sometimes we made mistakes that turned them against us. So part of that manual described their shift from, I forget the exact phrase right now, and I don't have quick recall, but basically winning hearts and minds. I think that's what I was looking for. So trying not to offend the local customs, trying to build relationships. That way you don't get people turning against you, and they're more likely to help you because they don't really want war in their area, and they don't necessarily want the people that, the Americans were after in their area. They, just like all humans, they want a peaceful society where they can take care of their families. So that manual sort of described how the tactics were evolved, even though we had all these advanced weapons. These paragraphs are sort of describing how that's now a push-pull relationship. Tactics may have to take the precedent and shape the weapons, and sometimes the weapons take precedent and shape the tactics. Building the weapons to fit the fight, an approach which has the distinctive features of the age and the characteristics of the laboratory, may not only be viewed as a kind of active choice, it can also be taken as coping with shifting events by sticking to a fundamental principle. And in addition to being a major breakthrough in the history of preparing for war, it also implies the potential crisis in modern warfare. Customizing weapon systems to tactics, which are still being explored and studied, is like preparing food for a great banquet without knowing who is coming, where the slightest error can lead one far astray. Viewed from the performance of the U.S. military in Somalia, where they were at a loss when they encountered Aidid's forces, the most modern military force does not have the ability to control public clamor and cannot deal with an opponent who does things in an unconventional manner. On the battlefields of the future, the digitized forces may very possibly be like a great cook who is good at cooking lobsters sprinkled with butter. When faced with guerrillas who resolutely gnaw corn cobs, they can only sigh in despair. The, quote, generation gap in weapons and military forces is perhaps an issue that requires exceptional attention. The closer the generation gap is, the more pronounced are the battle successes of the more senior generation, while the more the gap opens, the less each party is capable of dealing with the other, and it may reach the point where no one can wipe out the other. Looking at the specific examples of battles that we have, it is difficult for high-tech troops to deal with unconventional warfare and low-tech warfare, and perhaps there is a rule here, or at least it is an interesting phenomenon which is worth studying. And again, like I just said, that was, semi-prophetic with the 20-year plus war that we got dragged into. All right, we just got a couple more sections of this and then we're done. Weapons of new concepts and new concepts of weapons. Compared to new concept weapons, nearly all the weapons that we have known so far may be termed old concept weapons. The reason they are called old is because the basic functions of these weapons were their mobility and lethal power. Even things like precision-guided bombs and other such high-tech weapons really involve nothing more than the addition of two elements of intelligence and structural capabilities. From the perspective of practical applications, no change in appearance can alter their nature as traditional weapons, that is, their control throughout by professional soldiers and their use on certain battlefields. All these weapons and weapons platforms that have been produced in line with traditional thinking have, without exception, come to a dead end in their efforts to adapt to modern warfare and future warfare. Those desires of the magic of high technology to work some alchemy on traditional weapons so that they are completely remade have ultimately fallen into the high-tech trap, involving the endless waste of limited funds and an arms race. This is the paradox that must inevitably be faced in the process of the development of traditional weapons. To ensure that the weapons are in the lead, one must continue to up the ante in development costs. The result of this continued raising of the stakes is that no one has enough money to maintain the lead. Its ultimate result is that the weapons to defend the country actually become a cause of natural bankruptcy. That's a huge critical point and great insight. It's actually something both sides of the political spectrum, I think, actually agree on. Let's say the hard left thinks that we should basically be demilitarizing drastically, and to the point of, taking it to the extreme, you could say they would want no military and we should just magically evolve into a utopia of world oneness. And that's, maybe that's what the elites want to. And then on the extreme right, which is typically more pro-military, when you get into the more libertarian side of it, even they don't want the bullshit military-industrial complex that they know degrades our country and that gets us involved with endless wars. The military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell speech. People like Ron Paul. You had a huge movement in 2012 to support Ron Paul. These are more conservative-leaning people, but they can mesh together with what the left wants. Although the left thinks that we should just take the funds from the military and keep giving them back to more social programs, the more hard right, libertarian right, thinks, we should also eliminate the incredible spending in that sector, but maybe we shouldn't be feeding the central government that much tax base in the first place. so that we can keep more of those funds closer to our own families and our own communities. But in general, that rock of criticism is something both sides agree on, both populist sides, and is something the mainstream media and the establishment ignore because they're all part of this one hegemony that loves the military-industrial complex. But interesting they cite that. It is something that has, we've wasted trillions potentially in some of these wars trying to be world police. But China sees that. They obviously saw that 20 years ago and weren't going to try to necessarily race us directly. Going back to the Cold War with Russia, you might say that's possibly part of the reason that the former Soviet Union collapsed. We were locked in a Cold War arms race with them, both spending immense amounts of money, and one of us collapsed, and that was Russia. Let's take a look at that last sentence one more time. To ensure that the weapons are in the lead, one must continue to up the ante in development costs. The result of this continued raising of the stakes is that no one has enough money to maintain the lead. Its ultimate result is the weapons to defend the country actually become a cause of national bankruptcy. Perhaps the most recent examples are the most convincing. Marshal Orgakov, the former chief of the Soviet General Staff, was acutely aware of the trend of weapons development in the nuclear age, and when, at an opportune time, he proposed the brand new concept of, quote, revolution in military technology, his thinking was clearly ahead of those of his generation. But being ahead of time in his thinking hardly brought his country happiness, and actually brought about disastrous results. As soon as this concept, which against the backdrop of the Cold War was seen by his colleagues as setting the pace for the time, was proposed, it further intensified the arms race which had been going on for some time between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was just that, at that time, no one could predict that it would actually result in the breakup of the Soviet Union and its complete elimination from the superpower contest. So yeah, interesting. I just was talking about that before they rolled into that. A powerful empire collapsed without a single shot being fired, vividly corroborating the lines of the famous poem by Kipling, "When empires perish, it is not with a rumble, but a snicker." Not only was this true for this former Soviet Union, today the Americans seem to be following in the footsteps of their old adversary, providing fresh proof of the paradox of weapons development that we have proposed. As the outlines of the age of technology integration become increasingly clear, they are investing more and more in the development of new weapons, and the cost of the weapons is getting higher and higher. The development of the F-14 and F-15 in the 60s and 70s cost $1 billion, while the development of the B-2 in the 80s cost over $10 billion, and the development of the F-22 in the 90s has exceeded $13 billion. Based on weight, the B-2, which runs $13 to $15 billion each, is some 3 times more expensive than an equivalent weight of gold. Expensive weapons like that abound in the U.S. arsenal, such as the F-117A bomber, the F-22 main combat aircraft, and the Comanche helicopter gunship. The cost of each of these weapons exceeds or approaches $100 million, and this massive amount of weapons with unreasonable cost-effectiveness has covered the U.S. military with increasingly heavy armor, pushing them step by step toward the high-tech weapons trap, where the cost stakes continue to be raised. If this is still true for the rich and brash United States, then how far can the other countries, who are short of money, continue down this path? Obviously, it will be difficult for anyone to keep going. Naturally, the way to extricate oneself from this predicament is to develop a different approach. And right there is where you see the potential turning point. I don't know how quickly they're going to do that, but they're building out their thesis by setting up the problem, and now I expect them soon to get to the setup of the strategy that they've been taking over the last 20 decades and have really been ramping up in the past year. Therefore, new concept weapons have emerged to fill the bill. However, what seems unfair to people is that it is again the Americans who are in the lead in this trend. As early as the Vietnam War, the silver iodide powder released over the Ho Chi Minh Trail that resulted in torrential rains and the defoliants scattered over the subtropical forests put the, quote, American devils in the sole lead with regard to both the methods and ruthlessness of new concept weapons. 30 years later, with dual advantages of money and technology, others are unable to hold a candle to them in this area. Talking about cloud seeding with the silver iodide, which is pretty interesting. And then the defoliants are things like Agent Orange, courtesy of Monsanto, just like your little Roundup that you spray on your sidewalks. However, the Americans are not necessarily in the sole lead in everything. The new concepts of weapons, which came after the weapons of new concepts and which cover a wider area, were a natural extension of this. However, the Americans have not been able to get their act together in this area. This is because proposing a new concept of weapons does not require relying on the springboard of new technology. It just demands lucid and incisive thinking. However, this is not a strong point of the Americans, who are slaves to technology in their thinking. The Americans invariably halt their thinking at the boundary where technology has not yet reached. It cannot be denied that man-made earthquakes, tsunamis, weather disasters, or subsonic wave and new biological and chemical weapons all constitute new concept weapons, and that they have tremendous differences with what we normally speak of as weapons, but they are still all weapons whose immediate goal is to kill and destroy, and which are still related to military affairs, soldiers, and munitions. Speaking in this sense, they are nothing more than non-traditional weapons whose mechanisms have been altered and whose lethal power and destructive capabilities have been magnified several times over. So, very disturbing. They even address that. It puts all kinds of events into question. It cannot be denied that man-made earthquakes, tsunamis, weather disasters, or subsonic wave and new biological and chemical weapons all constitute new concept weapons. I don't even want to go down that trail right now in speculation. However, a new concept of weapons is different. This and what people call new concept weapons are two entirely different things. While it may be said that new concept weapons are weapons which transcend the domain of traditional weapons, which can be controlled and manipulated at a technical level, and which are capable of inflicting material or psychological casualties on an enemy, in the face of the new concept of weapons, such weapons are still weapons in a narrow sense. This is because the new concept of weapons is a view of weapons in the broad sense, which views as weapons all means which transcend the military realm, but which can still be used in combat operations. In its eyes, everything that can benefit mankind can also harm him. This is to say that there is nothing in the world today that cannot become a weapon, and this requires that our understanding of weapons must have an awareness that breaks through all boundaries. With technological developments being in the process of striving to increase the types of weapons, a breakthrough in our thinking can open up the domain of the weapons kingdom at one stroke. As we see it, a single man-made stock market crash, a single computer virus invasion, or a single rumor or scandal that results in a fluctuation in the enemy country's exchange rates or exposes the leaders of an enemy country on the internet, all can be included in the ranks of new concept weapons. A new concept of weapons provides direction for new concept weapons, while the new concept weapons themselves, I'm going to add, give fixed forms to the aforementioned. With regard to the flood of new concept weapons, technology is no longer the main factor, and the true underlying factor is, I'm going to just abbreviate, concept regarding weapons. They're basically repeating using the same phrase, how new concept hyphenated is the actual thing itself, whereas new concept without the hyphen right here, that's talking about expanding the mind, and they're saying that's where America's very limited. We are just obsessed with technology, and again, as I brought up the military-industrial complex, there's deep entrenched banking and commercial interests to keep us focused there, like a dazzling crystal ball dangled over us, trying to, convince our leaders, our politicians, that we need to be going after them. So people like Boeing, people like General Dynamics, people like Raytheon, they're in an obsessive war dance to just get us to keep investing in this stuff, and they are publicly funded. They are companies that have stockholders that they need to churn a profit out to. Our universities invest in them. This isn't a one-dimensional issue here, and what they're saying is America doesn't have the the wherewithal or the ability to expand our minds to see what could become a weapon. They highlighted the possibility of weather and natural disasters, and they also just lined up a bunch of stuff here, how a man-made stock market crash, a computer virus invasion, or even, this is very interesting, especially if you've been watching the mainstream media, and I don't even need to say it, if you've been watching the mainstream media the last 4 years, they're all obsessed with ridiculous things that have no basis in reality just to try to win a political battle. They're willing to use any lies possible, and that's indisputable if you're actually politically or aware of the media. It doesn't even matter what your political views are if you're actually intellectually honest. Knowing that China gives substantial money in advertising to our state media like CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, puts that all into perspective here reading this. Let's continue, and then we'll be reading the final section and close this up. What must be made clear is that the new concept of weapons is in the process of creating weapons that are closely linked to the lives of the common people. Let us assume that the first thing we say is, the appearance of new concept weapons will definitely elevate future warfare to a level which is hard for the common people, or even military men to imagine. Then the second thing we should have to say should be, the new concept of weapons will cause ordinary people and military men alike to be greatly astonished at the fact that commonplace things that are close to them can also become weapons with which to engage in war. We believe that some morning people will awake to discover with surprise that quite a few gentle and kind things have begun to have offensive and lethal characteristics. And this is the final section of this chapter, the trend to kinder weapons. Before the appearance of the atom bomb, warfare was always in a shortage age with respect to lethal power. Efforts to improve weapons have primarily been to boost their lethal power, and from the light kill weapons, represented by cold steel weapons and single-shot firearms, to the heavy kill weapons, represented by various automatic firearms. The history of the development of the weapons has almost always been a process of continuing to boost the lethal power of weapons. Prolonged shortages resulted in a thirst among military men for weapons of even greater lethal power that was difficult to satisfy. With a single red cloud that arose over the wasteland of New Mexico in the United States, military men were finally able to obtain a weapon of mass destruction that fulfilled their wishes. As this could not only completely wipe out the enemy, it could kill them 100 or 1,000 times over. This gave mankind lethal capabilities that exceeded the demand, and for the first time there was some room to spare with regard to lethal power in war. Philosophical principles tell us that whenever something reaches an ultimate point, it will turn in the opposite direction. The invention of nuclear weapons, this ultra-lethal weapon, which can wipe out all mankind, has plunged mankind into an existential trap of its own making. Nuclear weapons have become a sword of Damocles hanging over the head of mankind, which forces it to ponder, do we really need ultra-lethal weapons? What is the difference between killing an enemy once and killing him 100 times? What is the point of defeating the enemy if it means risking the destruction of the world? How do we avoid warfare that results in ruin for all? A balance of terror involving mutually assured destruction was the immediate product of this thinking, but its byproduct was to provide a braking mechanism for the runaway express of improving the lethal capabilities of weapons, which was continually picking up speed, so that the development of weapons was no longer careening crazily down the light kill weapons, heavy kill weapons, ultra-lethal weapons expressway, with people trying to find a new approach to weapons development which would not only be effective, but which could also exercise control over the lethal power of the weapons. Any major technological invention will have a profound human background. The, quote, Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948, and the more than 50 subsequent pacts related to it have established a set of international rules for human rights in which it is recognized that the use of weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, is a serious violation of the right to life and represents a crime against mankind. influenced by human rights and other new political concepts, plus the integration trend in international economics, the interlocking demands and political positions involving the interests of various social and political forces, the proposal of the concept of ultimate concern for the ecological environment, and particularly the value of human life, have resulted in misgivings about killing and destruction, forming a new value concept for war and new ethics for warfare. The trend to kinder weapons is nothing other than a reflection in the production and development of weapons of this great change in man's cultural background. At the same time, technological progress has given us the means to strike at the enemy's nerve center directly without harming other things, giving us numerous new options for achieving victory. And all these make people believe that the best way to achieve victory is to control, not to kill. There have been changes in the concept of war and the concept of weapons, and the approach of using uncontrolled slaughter to force the enemy into unconditional surrender has now become the relic of a bygone age. Warfare has now taken leave of the meat grinder age of Verdun-like campaigns. The appearance of precision kill, accurate weapons, and non-lethal, non-fatal weapons is a turning point in the development of weapons, showing for the first time that weapons are developing in a kinder, not a stronger direction. Precision kill weapons can hit a target precisely, reducing collateral casualties, and like a gamma knife which can excise a tumor with hardly any bleeding, it has led to, quote, surgical strikes and other such new tactics, so that inconspicuous combat actions can achieve extremely notable strategic results. For example, by merely using one missile to track a mobile telephone signal, the Russians were able to still forever the tough mouth of Dudayev, I might be saying that wrong, who was a headache, and at the same time eased the enormous trouble that had been stirred up by tiny Chechnya. Non-lethal weapons can effectively eliminate the combat capabilities of personnel and equipment without loss of life. The trend that is embodied in these weapons shows that mankind is in the process of overcoming its own extreme thinking, beginning to learn to control the lethal power that it already has, but which is increasingly excessive. In the massive bombing that lasted more than a month during the Gulf War, the loss of life among civilians in Iraq only numbered in the thousands, far less than in the massive bombing of Dresden during World War II. Kinder weapons represent the latest conscious choice of mankind among various options in the weapons arena, by which, after the weapons are infused with the element of new technology, the human component is then added, thereby giving warfare an unprecedented kind-hearted hue. However, a kinder weapon is still a weapon, and it does not mean that the demands of being kinder will reduce the battlefield effectiveness of the weapon. To take away a tank's combat capabilities, one can use cannons or missiles to destroy it, or a laser beam can be used to destroy its optical equipment or blind its crew. On the battlefield, someone who is injured requires more care than someone who is killed, and unmanned weapons can eliminate increasingly expensive protective facilities. Certainly, those developing kinder weapons have already done cold cost-effectiveness calculations of this. Casualties can strip away an enemy's combat capabilities, causing him to panic and lose the will to fight. So this may be considered an extremely worthwhile way to achieve victory. Today, we already have enough technology, and we can create many methods of causing fear which are more effective, such as using a laser beam to project the image of injured followers against the sky. Today we already have enough technology, and we can create many methods of causing fear which are more effective, such as using a laser beam to project the image of injured followers against the sky, which would be sufficient to frighten those soldiers who are devoutly religious. There are no longer any obstacles to building this kind of weapon, it just requires that some additional imagination be added to the technical element. Kinder weapons represent a derivative of the new concept of weapons, while information weapons are a prominent example of kinder weapons, whether it involves electromagnetic energy weapons for hard destruction, or soft strikes by computer logic bombs, network viruses, or media weapons. All are focused on paralyzing and undermining, not personnel casualties. Kinder weapons, which could only be born in an age of technical integration, may very well be the most promising development trend for weapons, and at the same time, they will bring about forms of war or revolutions in military affairs which we cannot imagine or predict today. They represent a change with the most profound implications in the history of human warfare to date, and are the watershed between the old and the new forms of war. This is because their appearance has been sufficient to put all the wars in the age of cold and hot weapons into the, quote, old era. Nonetheless, we still cannot indulge in romantic fantasies about technology, believing that from this point on, war will become a confrontation like an electronic game, and even simulated warfare in a computer room similarly must be premised upon a country's actually overall capabilities. And if a colossus with feet of clay comes up with 10 plans for simulated warfare, it will still not be sufficient to deter an enemy who is more powerful with regard to actual strength. War is still the ground of death and life, the path of survival and destruction, and even the slightest innocence is not tolerated. Even if someday all the weapons have been made completely humane, a kinder war in which bloodshed may be avoided is still war. It may alter the cruel process of war, but there is no way to change the essence of war, which is one of compulsion, and therefore it cannot alter its cruel outcome either. So, pretty important developments through that chapter. What can I say in summary if you're still listening? They really kind of open a Pandora's box, let's just say, in terms of concept war. They bring up some stuff which cast some serious doubts on events that have happened in the last 20 years. Don't really know what I could add right now. It takes quite a bit to read that long and to narrate that long. My voice is already starting to give out. They have a lot of footnotes here, so if you actually go to this and read through it, these might be worth referencing. A lot of historical references. Some discussion how we talked about earlier of the interlinking between biotechnology and information technology. They have a citation here. Macromolecular systems designed and produced using biotech represent the production materials for even higher order electronic components. For example, protein molecule computers have computation speeds and memory capabilities hundreds of millions of times greater than our current computers. From New Military Perspectives for the Next Century. We're not going to really read through these footnotes, but they do develop on the text quite a bit. A lot of references. They're very well read, broadly researched. I think I'm going to go through one or two more chapters of this. They're pretty long. It takes a lot out of me to read through them, but this is a super important book for today's events. We are literally in war, so it's good to know the enemy. So next time we'll read Chapter 2, The War God's Face Has Become Indistinct. Thanks for listening, guys. If you found value in this, please share it. Share it directly with somebody. Send them a text. YouTube gives you a little share button. You can copy the URL, put it into your text messenger. You could share it on social media. I get more views on BitChute. Jump over to BitChute if you want to be part of a different alternative tech community. BitChute's far more free speech than YouTube is, so that's where I'm going right now. But that comes with some drawbacks, so if you're more of a sensitive viewer, don't go over there. That's it. Mooring out. Thanks for listening, guys. Peace out.